What is our guest presenter Jim Bovard's take on the critical importance of civil liberties? Join Richard Ebeling and me and Jim Bovard in this special issue of Libertarian Angle as we launch our new online 6-week series, The Critical Importance of Civil Liberties. Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and welcome to this week's special Libertarian Angle. I'm joined by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, and our first special guest presenter, Jim Bovard, that is part of our special series that we're going to have for the next 6 weeks on the critical importance of civil liberties. So we're changing the formula for Libertarian Angle. We're going to have 6 guest presenters who are among the most stalwart of advocates of civil liberties. Why are we doing this? Well, because of the critical importance of civil liberties to a free society. Future of Freedom Foundation, as you all know, has long been committed to a free society, and not only in terms of economic liberty, but also in terms of civil liberties. And it's sometimes easy to forget that in order to achieve a free society, you've got to have both economic liberty and civil liberties. And I think civil liberties are under the biggest assault and attack in our lifetimes. And so we said, let's put together this series of talks over the next 6 weeks with presenters that I think you're going to really enjoy, find very, very valuable in this area of civil liberties. And our first guest is, I'm sure you all are familiar with, is Jim Bovard. Jim's been writing for the Future of Freedom Foundation almost since our inception 35 years ago. It's always been a big honor that he writes for our monthly journal, Future of Freedom, every month. And his articles are just outstanding. And he's one of the principal defenders and proponents of civil liberties in the country. And let me give you a little bit summary of his bio. He's the author of 11 books, including his most famous, Lost Rights, The Death of American Liberty. He's written for all sorts of prominent publications, the Wall Street Journal, New York Times, Playboy, Washington Post, New Republic, Reader's Digest. He's a frequent contributor to the New York Post as well. He's on the USA Today Board of Contributors. The Wall Street Journal calls him the roving inspector general of the modern state. The New York Times calls him the anti-czar czar. Washington Post columnist George Willard calls him a one-man truth squad. He's received awards for his work, including the Thomas Szasz Award for Civil Liberties. And among his biggest compliments is what U.S. officials have said about him, federal officials. He's been denounced by the chief of the FBI, the TSA, the Secretary of Labor, the Secretary of Agriculture, the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development, DEA, and a host of others. So it's a real honor, Jim, to have you here kicking off this series on the critical importance of civil liberties. The format's going to be that Jim's going to talk for as long as he wants, and then Richard and I will be interacting with him with respect to what he talks about. Jim, take it away.
Jacob, thanks very much for your kind words. Thanks for that very kind introduction. I want to thank FFF for the opportunity to comment on civil liberties crisis. I also want to thank Jacob and Richard for all that I've learned from each of them over the last 30 years. They've both done so much pioneering work. They've both been so courageous, and they've held up the flag of liberty when a lot of other freedom people who said they were pro-freedom took a dive or went to the other side of the barricades. But y'all have not done that, and I appreciate that. I still like Jacob, even if he does get into a ruckus when he goes out for a barbecue sandwich. So I first wrote for FFF back in 1994, and little did I know that at that point that we'd come back to that, we'd look back on that as the golden age of American liberty, because at that point, the first year I wrote for them was a year after the Janet Reno sent in the tanks at Waco and ended up with 80 dead people there. So the media made her a saint. But it's fascinating to look at the evolution of Americans' thoughts on liberty and Americans and what the federal government is doing. If you look back at how the Clinton administration had gone, there was a soaring number of wiretaps. The Clinton folks converted cell phones into homing devices for law enforcement so that the government could track you wherever you went with a cell phone. It turned bankers into spies against their customers. Free speech and privacy were devastated again and again. From dictating how many pairs of Chinese silk panties Americans could buy to mandating that people on Prozac could arrive late at work, thanks to the Disabilities Act, Clinton's efforts continued endlessly meddled with Americans' lives. I mean, Clinton was one of his forgotten path-breaking things was that he sought to mandate trigger locks for all the handguns in crack houses. Um, no aspect of Americans' life was too arcane for federal intervention. And if you look at what he did on privacy, almost everybody's forgotten. You turn back the clock 32 years, Bill Clinton was pushing for Clipper chips, which would have been backdoor spy chips in every computer sold. The Clinton administration claimed that the police had a right to conduct no-knock raids in any house that had a flush toilet. It was important to avoid destroying the evidence. I was at a Supreme Court hearing on that case, and I laughed at the wrong time, and I got thrown out of court. So, story of my life. The Clinton administration gave massive amounts of military equipment to police departments that helped them conduct war against hapless Americans. Clinton effectively claimed the right to ban semi-automatic rifles and pistols, even though tens of millions of those were owned by private citizens. And it didn't matter what the government did, the government was the savior. Clinton portrayed government as the Lone Ranger, or more accurately, millions of Lone Rangers, each with a sacred mission to rescue people, whether they want to be rescued or not. Now, it's interesting. I think back to some of the FFF conferences that Jacob, Richard, and I and others spoke at in the late 1990s, and there was hope that Americans at that point were catching on to the perils of federal power and that it was time to put politicians on a leash. Well, that was a brief hope. After the 9/11 attacks, faith in government doubled within a few weeks, and politicians exploited that to unleash themselves. We had the Patriot Act, which treats every citizen like a suspected terrorist and every federal agent like a proven angel. What the Bush administration did with that act, it carried off the greatest bait and switch in American history. It talked about targeting terrorists, but those new powers could be used against anyone charged with 4,000 different federal crimes in the statute book. What they did was also convert that terrorist attack into a trump card against American privacy. The Patriot Act entitled the FBI to cannibalize the Americans' email with the carnivore wiretapping system. The FBI crafted computer viruses that they could send covertly by email to wiretap people's computers. The feds got far along to getting total information awareness on all American citizens. And it wasn't just a few isolated policies. Shortly after the 9/11 attacks, Attorney General John Ashcroft went to the U.S. Senate and announced and condemned critics as traitors. Ashcroft said, "Those who scare peace-loving people with phantoms of lost liberty only aid terrorists, for they erode our national unity and give ammunition to America's enemies." Hey, he was practically talking about FFF's job description. Personally, I wasn't giving ammo to anybody. I was simply documenting how the Bush administration was turning freedom into a phantom. You had all these federal agencies, these new agencies that took those words and put them into action. And in 2003, the Federal Homeland Security Department urged local police departments to view critics of the war on terrorism as potential terrorists. In a 2003 terrorist advisory, Homeland Security warned local law enforcement to keep an eye on anyone who, quote, expressed dislike of attitudes and decisions of the U.S. government, except people with think tanks, of course. 9/11 permanently reduced the freedom of Americans, or at least has done that so far. In 1999, 2 years before those attacks, the Supreme Court recognized that the constitutional right to travel from one state to another is firmly embedded in our jurisprudence, well, except for the TSA. TSA was created shortly after 9/11, and it has tyrannized Americans ever since. TSA's whole body scanners have doused tens of millions of travelers with radiation while taking nude pictures of them. TSA entitled its screeners to use more aggressive um, search. Um, there's a better way to say it. TSA entitled its screeners to use more aggressive search groping than the U.S. military guards were allowed to use on suspected terrorists at Guantanamo a decade ago. There have been thousands of complaints from women about how they feel like they were sexually assaulted at TSA checkpoints. It hasn't mattered. The TSA screeners have immunity for almost anything which they do there on the job. And these terrorists and the TSA has all these endless profiles which interfere with your traveling. We learned just a week or two ago that the TSA created 4 years ago a secret watch list to ban or restrict people from flying who had publicly criticized President Biden's COVID mask mandate. That was called Operation Freedom to Breathe. Freedom to breathe for TSA screeners or what? Dozens of people were banned from flying because of that. And it only ended when a federal judge struck down Biden's mask mandate. But it was typical of the kind of absurd stretching of power that has happened in so many different agencies in recent decades and has victimized far more freedom than what we realize. But government outrages go far beyond the TSA. Americans nowadays have the freedom to be fleeced, wiretapped, injected, censored, ticketed, disarmed, beaten, vilified, detained, and maybe shot by government agents. Politicians are hell-bent on protecting citizens against everything except Uncle Sam. More than 10 million Americans are arrested each year. Thanks to the Supreme Court, police can lock up anyone accused of even a very minor criminal offense, such as an unbuckled seatbelt. To see how this turns out, how this works out in real life, take a look at what happened with the COVID pandemic. 2 weeks to flatten the curve became years to flatten the Constitution. Governors in a number of states effectively placed tens of millions of people under house arrest, and with heavy penalties if you went to go to visit your relatives. In places like Los Angeles, the mayor prohibited people from going out for a walk or a bike ride. And it didn't matter that there was no good reason for that. You had so many people being arrested for sitting out on a bench in New Jersey or for just being on a beach by themselves. It was as if total submission was the only way to survive. But at the same time, you had the government lying up and down about what it knew and what had preceded that epidemic. You had a massive cover-up from the start of the U.S. government role in financing the reckless research at the Chinese lab that leaked out and killed 7 million people around the world. Once going back to mid-late 2020, once President Trump announced Operation Warp Speed, there was a huge push to suppress information or any criticism of the vaccines that were rushed into development. You had the FDA give emergency approval, perhaps based on threats from the White House. You sign this off, or else bad things happen. Certainly, that was how the FDA gave final approval to the Pfizer COVID vaccine. You had the Biden White House basically holding a gun to the head of the FDA officials, and a number of their top vaccine experts resigned because they refused to give full approval to the emergency vaccine. There was all kinds of evidence that those COVID vaccines were causing myocarditis, high rates among young males, a lot of other side effects. All that was swept under the rug because the government, because politicians had decided this was how they were going to protect the American people. It's interesting to think about how the baseline for American freedom has changed over the last few decades. Back in the 1990s, local bureaucrats would sporadically crack down on homeschooling, preventing a smattering of parents from teaching their own kids. But during the COVID epidemic, teacher unions spurred unjustified school lockdowns that victimized tens of millions of children. Vast learning losses resulted that continue to plague young lives. And you had a skyrocketing rate of suicide, attempted suicide, depression, and drug abuse among young people who were suddenly isolated in their formative years. And what does the government do afterwards? The Surgeon General puts out a report. Well, it looks like people are really suffering from loneliness. Maybe we need a new federal program for that. If you had not inflicted the lockdowns on people, there would have been far more natural development. And the same thing happened, if you look, um, it's funny that people think the government's going to save them. One of the biggest absurdities of the pandemic was the government mask mandates for very young children. You had Head Start programs where you've got toddlers 2 years old, 3 years old, and the feds mandated those kids had to wear a mask. Well, I don't know how many parents have tried to mask a 2 year old, but it doesn't go well. And it was just created so much strife and unnecessary conflict. And it didn't do any good as far as limiting the spread. And besides that, there were very, very few fatalities from COVID among young children. But at the same time, you had Biden out there pushing, trying to mandate COVID vaccines for kids who were 6 months old and older. And it's like they simply ignored the evidence of the side effects. Going back to the 1990s, there were controversies that erupted when some schools gave free condoms to teenagers. Nowadays, many of the nation's largest school systems encourage children to agonize over their own gender identity from kindergarten or from pre-K here in Montgomery County, Maryland, from pre-K on to high school. And this massive government propaganda operation has muddled millions of kids' heads. In Montgomery County, Maryland, 45% of the kids in junior high self-identified as gender fluid or as non-binary. And, this is a full employment program for therapists. And it also works out great for the pharmaceutical companies that get to sell the kids hormone blockers forever. But if you look at the impact of those hormone blockers or the chemical castration, those are far more devastating for young people than a handful of free condoms given to teenagers of decades earlier. In 1990, civil liberties groups challenged drug tests that were mandated for workers as part of the war on drugs. 2021, Biden decreed that 80 million plus Americans working for private companies had to get the COVID vaccine injections. After millions of people took those injections, the Supreme Court said it's all bullshit and struck down Biden's order. But neither Biden nor his political appointees have any liability for that illicit command or the adverse side effects of the vax. Biden issued a pardon for Tony Fauci, absolving every crime Fauci might have committed in the previous 10 years, including secretly financing that COVID research that leaked out in China. The key to civil liberties is government under the law. And we don't have that now. We didn't have it under Biden. It might have been a very long time since we've had that in this country. But if you look at some of the things that the Trump administration is doing, there are jaw-dropping abuses. It's the kind of thing that makes even me almost cynical. Let me pull this up. Okay, my software. Okay. So what we've had under Trump is another federal war on free speech. Back in um, 1956, Friedrich Hayek, in a foreword to a new edition of his Road to Serfdom, he said, "If it is known that authorities have power to coerce, few people will wait for actual coercion." And that is what has happened with the Trump administration policy to punish people who speak out, criticizing U.S. foreign policy, for instance. On March 25th, six masked federal agents seized a Turkish grad student on the streets of Somerville, Massachusetts. Um, I'm not even going to try her first name. Her last name is Ozturk. She was wearing a hijab. She was a Fulbright scholar working on a doctorate at Tufts University. She was grabbed off the street, and at first she thought that the agents were going to kill her. She vanished into the maw of the federal detention system. She was put in leg shackles. She had a chain around her waist. She was frog marched out like she was a terrorist kingpin. The Trump administration moved her around from state to state to try to block her challenges against her arrest, and they were rushing to deport her, and they were kind of vague as far as what she had actually done. Homeland Security spokesman said that the DHS and ICE investigations found that Ozturk engaged in activities in support of Hamas, a foreign terrorist organization that relishes the killing of Americans. Glorifying and supporting terrorists who kill Americans is grounds for a visa issuance to be terminated. But all she did was write an op-ed. She co-wrote an op-ed in a Tufts student newspaper. She was criticizing the Tufts University administrators for um, for not upholding a student Senate resolution calling for divesting investments in Israel, uh, thanks to the ongoing carnage in Gaza that began in 2000, well, that had accelerated in early 2000 in 2024. But it didn't matter that that was all the evidence that they had. Secretary of State Rubio said, "Every time I find one of these lunatics, I take away their visas." But the Washington Post had a great leak. It said the Washington Post came out and said, actually, internal State Department documents showed they have nothing on this woman except the op-ed. And there was a recent court decision that came down and said that again, it was simply an op-ed. And if you're going to be trying to deport people for simply writing an op-ed, but this is something which goes back to that Hayek quote. If people know that they're going to be coerced, most people are just going to submit. And a federal court decision a week or two ago talked about how the Oster case was an example of how the federal government, how the Trump administration was trying to frighten tens of millions of people into silence to avoid getting deported or to avoid other legal problems. You've had some groups who have called for the U.S. government to cancel the citizenship of naturalized U.S. citizens who criticize a foreign government. You've also had the Trump administration take this vastly further with the kind of dictates that they're seeking to impose upon colleges. A lot of colleges have had have been intolerant towards conservatives or libertarians or anyone who isn't kind of in support of very progressive, often heavy-handed government policies. However, what the Trump folks are trying to do is effectively impose a new orthodoxy on college campuses that receive federal aid, federal grants. You had Trump people basically threatening $1 billion penalty on Harvard unless Harvard signed away its free speech rights to federal auditors. Um, and it's funny going back 30 years. Um, to lost rights, there was a chapter in there I had entitled Subsidies and Subjugation. And I tried to make clear in that chapter that once you start taking federal subsidies, it's only a matter of time until politicians or bureaucrats come along and demand your submission. I mean, and we're seeing that massively with the Trump administration. I'm happy to see some of the courts are pushing back on that, but to see how far the Trump administration has gone is jaw-dropping. There's a lot of other Trump stuff to talk about. Jacob's done a great job covering that over the last 8 or 9 months. I want to wrap up here with a couple of thoughts. I was on Libertarian Angle with y'all a few weeks or a couple months ago, and I was kind of I was saying, things don't look so good for freedom right now. And either Jacob or Richard say, well, but think of Cobden and Brighton, what they did with the fighting the Corn Laws in Britain and how that was a revolution and how they persuaded people. And I said, yeah, that's a good point. And then afterwards, I was checking my calendar, and it turned out that was almost 200 years ago. Um, Things are not looking good. Things have gotten a whole lot worse than what they were. I want to hear from Richard because one of the things that concerns me is Richard's been a college professor for, I guess, almost 40 years or 40 years. And what changes have you seen in students' reading ability and reading comprehension? Because some of these arguments for individual liberty and the dangers of government require focus and concentration and some knowledge of history and some gut sense. This is how people get a BS radar for, I mean, both liberal politicians, conservative politicians, anybody. You need to have to be able to focus and get that comprehension in your reading and learning. And um, I've heard a lot of things about how college students are not nearly as attentive or fill in the blank than what they were even a few decades ago. And as someone, I mean, okay, I'm biased because as a writer, I often put a lot of effort into the first paragraph of an article I write. And I see someone reading on the phone, and they're kind of, okay, flip, all right, next. I'm like, no, 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 there are only 3 sentences. Read each sentence. These are good sentences. And I just wonder if there's if the intellectual architecture is still being built in young people's minds to comprehend the value of liberty and the danger of political power.
All right, let me just say, Richard, before I turn it over to you, that absolutely excellent summation of the development of the assault and destruction of civil liberties in America. Richard, go ahead.
Yeah, I was thinking about the very things you were asking me about, Jim, very recently. I was going through some boxes in a closet, and among the things I found were course syllabi that I actually was using back in the 1990s, um, about actually the 1980s, the 1980s. It would have been when Jacob and I first met in Texas in the second half of the 1980s. And I looked over those course syllabi and compared it to the ones that I prepared today. I could never teach a course with that demand of attention and reading of my students today.
Wow, that's great. Well, it's bad, but that's a great insight.
The other thing I should say, yeah, uh, I've been completing a new book on liberty and the history of economic thought, which FFF is very kindly sponsoring the publication of.
Great.
And
Looking forward
I
to it.
was making comments in my acknowledgments, and I said that my interest in the history of ideas actually went back to when I was a teen, when I was first got interested in classical liberalism and libertarianism. But it was really reinforced during my undergraduate years, and I went to California State University, Sacramento. And all of my professors were textbook Keynesians or even Stalinist Marxists or Veblen type institutionalists. And they constantly were challenging the students and me, since I already held these libertarian views. Uh, uh, do you know the history of why we have modern society? Have you read these people of the past who left a mark of whether you agree with them or not? And I must mention that in spite of all of the intolerance and dogmatism and cancel culture in American universities today, here I am with Marxist and institutionalist and Keynesian professors. I never felt that they were biased in terms of grading against me. They were never rude or intolerant. They were unbelievably patient in saying, well, this guy holds old-fashioned ideas which they all thought were dead, and yet they would encourage me to read and think and argue, compared to most universities today. But I would say that the problem that you're referring to is the intellectual depth, the intellectual curiosity, the discipline of reading and thinking that, admittedly, with a degree of excessive nostalgia or I might have about when we were students or I was first teaching, um, is greatly weakened today, Jim. The students are not taught to think critically. Um, they're not taught or encouraged to read whole books or to reason with the author through taking seriously what is on the printed page and discussing it in their own minds with the author silently. It's all this caricature of cut and paste off Wikipedia and these cliches and caricatures of what's wrong with capitalism, what's right with reform and progressivism and socialism properly implemented. It's a very bad intellectual climate in higher education in particular now. And it makes it easier for the demagogues, the ideologues, the idea manipulators, those second-handers of ideas, as both Hayek and Ayn Rand refer to be able to warp and twist and unnaturally bend an entire generation of young people. And I despair about it a great deal myself.
Well, thanks. Those are great insights. It's great you're out there trying to counteract that, at least as far as you can. It's just the I think back to my late teens. As soon as I got out of high school, I had a natural love of reading that returned, and that was huge, shaping my fate as a writer, as whatever. But just a relish sitting down and reading all of Walden or all of Emerson's essays, or then getting into Montaigne and a lot of Voltaire's philosophical dictionary, stuff like that. And I just don't know if that's, does that still happen?
No. Now, I'm
Wow.
not saying that there wouldn't be particular professors in particular classes at particular institutions of higher learning, but I would say that in general, the most of what you and I would consider the great thinkers, and that doesn't mean they agree with us
Sure,
on
sure.
everything, right, as
Thomas Hobbes,
individually,
yeah.
but quote, the great thinkers, the great writers, what is sometimes referred to as the canon. Uh,
Yep.
the vast majority of students are never introduced to them. And often when you mention the name of some famous figure of the past, political, literary, philosophical, that you and I would have taken for granted to have been introduced to as students, those names just pass them by. In most cases, they've never even heard of them.
Wow.
Well,
Well, I'm sorry, go ahead.
no, go ahead, Jim.
No, Jacob, please go.
Well, I'm reminded of the exchange between two of the founding fathers. I forget who they are. Maybe Paine was one, where one said, "Wherever there is liberty, that is my home." And the other one responded, I think it was Paine responded, "Wherever there is not liberty, that is my home." And he considered it obviously a blessing to be living in a society where he had a chance to fight for liberty. And we've been blessed with that kind of life, the three of us, that we've been born and raised in a very statist controlled society. And I think we ought to be thanking our lucky stars for that, Jim. If we had been born in a free society, you would have nothing to write about. You wouldn't have written these 11 books. You'd be managing a local burger joint. And
And I'd be making everybody stand up for the Star
Star
Spangled
Spangled
Banner,
Banner,
12
right?
noon.
Jim, you touched on a lot of aspects of civil liberties. It's great, but you mentioned one that I think is not focused on enough, and I was wondering if you could just develop it in a short
Sure.
answer. And that's the financial privacy, the banks that have essentially become spies for the federal government. Can you talk a little bit about that? And, I mean, we've been so accustomed to it now. It's part of our everyday lives, know your customer and all that nonsense. Can you talk about financial privacy in general?
Yeah, it's interesting. If you turn back the clock, I did a story for Playboy, I think in 1998, on the first proposals for Know Your Customer regulations by the Clinton administration, Treasury Department, and the Federal Reserve. And there were a number of, there was a huge pushback against that. And there were some new regs that were put in, but it didn't go very far. But then after 9/11, the floodgates opened and any BS pretext would do to expand federal surveillance. And that's what happened. And one of the things which happened from that is that the feds and the IRS became a lot more aggressive on seizing anybody who supposedly structured their bank deposits and withdrawals. From 2005 to about 2012, the IRS was seizing more money from banks from customers who had deposited less than 10,000 or close to it or whatever, claiming that they were money laundering than the total amount stolen by bank robbers nationwide. And this was a scandal which kind of came out around 2014, 15, 16. You had the Inspector General, which came out and said that in 91% of the cases, there was no evidence of any criminal wrongdoing, but the IRS didn't care. What the IRS wanted to do is get numbers of these seizures that could brag about. And the IRS told its agents and federal prosecutors, don't go for the complex cases which might involve, drug deals, this, that, the other. People who have lawyers. Instead, go for the mom and pop grocery stores and stuff, which is what they did, and it was a great scandal. And part of what that came to mind recently, I did a piece on the Epstein on the Epstein case. There were recently some documents that came out that showed that he had over that just after he died, that the his bank, I guess J.P. Morgan and others, filed an ex post facto almost 5,000 suspicious activity reports with the federal government on the $1 billion of wire transfers and payoffs he had done to young women and others. But these were the same kind of suspicious activity reports the IRS used to ruin the lives of grocers, small restaurant owners, small farmers, and stuff like that, because there were all these new regulations, and they were all justified to control terrorism, but it had basically no effect on terrorists. But it gave the government so many other levers over people. And the same thing is happening now in other ways. And some of the push for digital currency, a national digital currency, central bank digital currency, is that the phrase? I mean, that would completely destroy financial freedom. But so many people don't realize that if you lose your financial freedom, then government's got you by the find some euphemism, and it'll make you do what you want, make you do what they want.
Thank you.
The other thing, before you had asked me that question towards the end of your comments, Jim, the thing that had struck my mind listening to you enumerate these changes in the status of civil liberties, especially just from the 90s with the Clinton administration. And it's hard and perverse to have to look back at the Clinton years as a golden age of everything from less abusive civil liberties compared to today, or the fact that we actually had budget surpluses for 4 years. It's like a golden age. But anyway, the thing that struck me is that how quickly people just adapt and take for granted and then acquiesce in the loss of these liberties. The new becomes taken for granted and the obviously all right. This is just the way the system works. And the idea that we have less freedom in traveling, less freedom in our personal and economic affairs, less liberty in making our own choices in association and the words we use and the arrangements we make with others, and our own public statement of the views of how we feel about social or cultural trends, and we may agree or disagree with the lifestyles of others. The loss of all this and the confining of our minds, our actions within a narrow and narrow corridor of acceptability, and how this is just taken as the normal and the taken for granted is perhaps is what is most chilling in thinking about the future of freedom.
Yes, I agree completely. Part of what I wrestle with is how many Americans still have the love of freedom that we just assume was almost our patrimony. Is that the right term? Um, because if you think back to when back when the three of us were coming of age in the 1960s or 70s, there was a natural pride in freedom, and now it's um, maybe someone's done a good survey to see what young, maybe there are surveys that contrast how young folks today identify individual liberty versus how young people in the 60s and 70s identified personal liberty. Because to see the to see what the government does, it doesn't set off alarms. I mean, the COVID mandates were a great example. You had these COVID lockdowns, and my impression was, and certainly with a lot of the initial protests
Mhm.
that were televised, whatever, the average age was probably 40s, 50s, older. And it was surprising how few young people raised hell about the government shutting down their colleges, their schools, and their lives because, they were basically paralyzed for a year, 2 years more. And um, I'm kind of appalled there's so little outrage when the evidence came out that the COVID vac. Yeah, it's interesting to see. One of the things I did not go into was the censorship under Biden, which simply exploded with social media, and it was like the danger of the virus justified complete muzzling of tens of millions of Americans. But I was talking with some folks recently, and I said, the biggest misinformation during the entire COVID pandemic was President Biden's promise in July 2021 that if you get the vaccine, you will not get COVID. And the CDC knew that was a lie at that point because they were having a surging number of COVID infections among the fully vaxxed. They were being covered up. But about 10 days or 7 or 8 days after that speech, it leaked out that a few weeks before then in Provincetown, Massachusetts, July 4th, there'd been a huge holiday celebration there. You had hundreds of fully vaxxed people there who came down with COVID. And it completely destroyed that narrative of the justification for the vaccines. But that did not stop Biden from, in early September 2021, from mandating the vaccines. And you had places like the Washington Post saying that the mandated vaccine would be a triumph of freedom because once you got vaccinated, you'd have more freedom in everyday life. And to see to see anybody making that kind of argument was just utterly chilling. Because, Richard, you're very familiar with the Stalin, the Soviet rhetoric on freedom. And this, you know, here again, I was asking about, young people and freedom and whether they still value it, but how many young people still have bullshit radars? Because to see what the politicians get away with, it's utterly jaw-dropping. I mean, Trump is doing some of the same thing, not on COVID vaccine mandates, but on a lot of other things. You just watch this, and like Trump was saying that the price of eggs is down, what do you say, 93%? And I'm thinking like 93% for people who can't count. But then again, there's a lot of those out there. So
But the one thing else is that you're talking about you know the changing attitudes on civil liberties and people being outraged or not. And I was thinking that if you go back to the 1960s, you had people like Mort Sahl and Lenny Bruce, and they were challenging conventions and whether you could really speak your mind, even if it offended people. Uh, and the young would be supportive of them. Didn't matter whether they always agreed with the politics of either Mort Sahl or Lenny Bruce. The idea is that you shouldn't be restricted from saying things even if offended and with people and was outrageous from the views of others. Compare fast forward that to the last several years. Oh, my professor has been hurtful to me.
Oh, yeah, yeah,
I haven't
great
had a
example.
trigger warning. I didn't know how to handle them referring to an idea or using a particular word. I mean, the upside down world from when there was conventionality and still forms of, public decency and blasphemy laws, and a Mort Sahl and Lenny Bruce, challenges them. And the youth of the country would say, yeah, man, speak your mind, man. Who cares if you offend a bunch of old folks? And that's the exact opposite of what campus life is today.
Wow, that's sad. Well, this whole notion of trigger warning, maybe I'm maybe I'm biased because I was raised in the mountains of Virginia and I was used to getting cussed from an early age. And I've been cussed often with my articles going back to at least to the 1980s. And so, okay, yeah, somebody hates me. What's new? Okay, what's for breakfast? But folks that are, you know, standing up for freedom requires a certain hardiness, if not a thick skin. And if someone can say, well, you're being disloyal or you're being insensitive because you're not saying that because someone who has changed their gender 3 times in the last month is changing it again, and you're saying, well, this is bogus. This there are so many more vetoes and so many more penalty flags being thrown on speech. And I think most of them are bullshit. I mean, if someone makes a death threat, yeah, that's going too far. But I mean, if someone, yeah, no, it's just. But Richard, you're on the front line on that, and you're in South Carolina, and hopefully people would not be as bad there as they are in Massachusetts. But I'm just folks, folks got to be tougher if they're going to survive in a free society. But the sad thing is that people are so illiterate on history and the nature of government is that people think that the government is going to protect them from the mean words.
Right.
And it's like, this is not what government does. So,
But it really sort of is the exaggerated result of the idea of the paternalistic state.
yes, exactly. Yes.
The state is to take care of my physical needs, my educational needs, my healthcare needs. I'm never to feel hurt or harmed or threatened. Everything is to be secure and safe. I'm to have a political cocoon surrounding me that I'm always safe, healthy, and happy. And this idea of protect me because the professor used, a bad word or brought up a subject that makes me feel uncomfortable is just like a cartoonish exaggeration of these perverse paternalistic expectations of what the political regime is supposed to do for you.
Yeah, very much. And it's like people who think they're entitled to the government being a psychological wet nurse 24/7. But going to your example of the what you can do or not do in the classroom, I think by far the greatest American novel is Huckleberry Finn, and I had that for many years sitting on my bedstand right next to 357. So it was something which I treasured and read so many times. And for people to say that, if you're too fragile to read Huckleberry Finn, you went wrong in life, or someone done you wrong, and you need to, what's the phrase? Toughen up. There's a phrase, not buckle up. Anyhow, just
One of the big problems I see, if not the biggest problem, is that people really believe, though, that they live in a free society. They're convinced they live in a free society, that all of this that y'all are talking about is just part and parcel of free society. Okay, it's not perfect, things can go wrong, but at least thank God I'm an American because at least I know I'm free. They embody Johann Goethe's famous quote that I just love. None are more hopelessly enslaved than those who falsely believe they are free. And the reason this impacts me so greatly is because I was one of them. I mean, I'd gone to the public schools. That's where it begins, and as well as the licensed private schools, the whole state educational system. They inculcate people with this mindset: you live in a free country. And then when I broke through to libertarianism, it was just, I mean, I could feel this inches thick casing of indoctrination that had encased my mind just cracking apart. I mean, I have more respect for somebody that says, Jacob, I understand we don't live in a free society and I don't care because what matters to me is the safety and security of the omnipotent state. That's more important to me than this free society you're talking about. Okay, that's a knowledgeable, conscious decision. What's dangerous is the person that says, Jacob, what are you talking about? Striving for a free society. We live in a free society. That's the big problem we face in this country, as far as I'm concerned.
Maybe so, but what I'm wondering is how many people still give a damn, even verbally, for freedom? Because I think it's a hell of a lot less popular than it was even when FFF was founded. Certainly going back to the 1970s, it's a whole lot less popular now. People are so much more docile. People are taking more of their values from the politicians. I mean, and you've had so many political promises to fix their profound problems, almost none of which were honored, and yet people are still deferring. People are still expecting the next president or this president is going to be the savior. And we've gone so far down that road that there's a cultural reinforcement. I mean, I see that in editors I deal with. It was a whole lot easier to push hardline pro-freedom op-eds in the 80s and 90s than it is nowadays. I mean, so many. I mean, there was one large publication I was pitching an article to on TSA abuses, and the editor who had seen my work for years, he says, "Well, I think it's a myth that TSA agents are out there abusing people. You know, there was an article I saw about the Henry Kissinger case, and it turned out it was all false criticism of the TSA. So I don't believe the TSA is doing that." And I'm thinking, holy mother of goodness, it's like, okay, fine. What's the thing? Um, Beyond hope, incorrigible. There's a better phrase, but there's a lot of editors I've seen like that who have, and it was a problem I've had off and on is that editors will see something else and say, well, the government couldn't be that bad. Well, shit, it's not my fault you're not paying attention.
All right, we only have 2 minutes left or so. Richard, do you want to give any concluding remarks here?
Yeah, I would just, both Jim and myself have either on our questions or our comments sounded very despondent, um, fearful that the sun is setting on liberty. And I'll just say, and Jim knows this from history too, this is not the first time it has seemed this way. Imagine those classical liberals and libertarians who were around in the 1930s. Mussolini, Hitler, Stalin, our own FDR. The twilight of liberty is gone. We're at the end of the road of any free enterprise. The state will nationalize or centrally plan everything. That's the future of the world coming out of World War II. And certainly, controls have been extended, liberties have been confined. But the fact is, the world has not gone totally totalitarian. Part has to do with the fact that there was still the cultural and the political legacies, the residues of before these crises of the 1930s. And they've been eaten away still more in the times that you've been emphasizing, Jim. But the fact is, there are still fundamental ideas that if you talk to ordinary people about their everyday lives, they want to make their own choices. They're often resentful that their income is taken for purposes that they have no agreement with or desire for, and that their eyes roll when they hear about government telling them about, what words they can use, or telling their son or daughter that they can be any gender among 57 and parents shouldn't be allowed to interfere or have parental insight or responsibility. There are many core cultural attitudes that the everyday person has that if you just scratch a little bit is still there. And that's the hope of awakening those, reinforcing those, expanding those to a more systematic and conscious level. That is an avenue for freedom to have a revival and a comeback.
Okay, but Richard, just don't tell me that Donald Trump is the new Konrad Adenauer.
No, he's not. Any more than the new Prime Minister of Japan, who says her role model is Margaret Thatcher, is anything like that, since she's an old-fashioned Keynesian who supports Trump and his national planning of where investment should be around the world.
All right. On that note, we'll wrap things up. Jim, this has been a real pleasure to have this conversation with you. Thank you very much for sharing your insights, for launching our new series here of the critical importance of civil liberties. Next week, we've got Radley Balco. If you're not familiar with Radley, you're going to love him. You can catch up with his writings on Substack under his title called The Watch. It's going to be another great program. Jim, thank you very much for your time and your insights.
Hey, thanks so much, Richard. Thanks, Jacob.
All
You
right.
take care, Jim.
Richard, as always, greatly enjoyed the visit, and I'll see you next week, Richard.
Until next time.
Cheers.